A white man pulled a knife on a black CEO's son mid-flight, hurling racist slurs. He had no clue four undercover federal agents were sitting just rows away. What happened next will leave you speechless. You must join our channel and hit subscribe, because only those who believe no black child should face violent threats will do it before this story begins. The moment the cabin doors sealed shut, Jordan Braxton felt a rare calm settle over him. Not the stillness of rest, but the calculated quiet of control, the kind he'd mastered over the years in boardrooms, at summits, and in the face of silence that too often followed the mention of his name. The engines of Flight 912 rumbled beneath the fuselage as the plane taxied away from the glowing runway of Port Del Mar International, climbing steadily into the cobalt sky. Jordan adjusted the cuffs of his navy suit, checking once more on the slim black folder in his leather carry-on. Inside were notes for the keynote speech he was scheduled to give in Capitol View, an address that would unveil Arcline Systems' new AI framework to a national audience. But his most important priority was sitting beside him. Ezra, his 17-year-old son, leaned back in his seat, earbuds in, gaze tilted toward the window. The boy had always been quieter than his peers, more observant than outspoken, a trait that mirrored Jordan in ways that made him both proud and quietly cautious. This flight was meant to be part business, part bonding, a brief escape before their names filled headlines again. But even in the quiet hum of first class, Jordan's instincts wouldn't let him fully relax. Across the aisle, an older white man sat stiffly in seat 3B. His name, as announced by the flight attendant during boarding, was Clayton Renshaw. Clayton had the leathery skin of someone who spent too much time under fluorescent light, his salt and pepper hair combed into submission, his eyes constantly flicking toward Ezra with an intensity that felt wrong. Jordan had noticed it during boarding, the way Clayton's gaze lingered just a second too long when Ezra passed him in the aisle, the way his jaw tensed when father and son took their seats in the front cabin. At first, Jordan dismissed it. You learn, over time, to let glances slide off your back. But when the seatbelt light turned off and passengers began settling in, Clayton's attention didn't wane. He kept looking, briefly, subtly, but with a sharpness Jordan could no longer ignore. Ezra shifted in his seat, pulling one earbud out. "Dad," he said quietly, "that man keeps looking over here." "I know," Jordan replied, keeping his voice low and measured. "Ignore him for now. Let's not give anyone a reason to feel important." Ezra nodded, but Jordan saw the stiffness in his shoulders. That quiet discomfort, the kind that was rarely loud enough to cause a scene but always heavy enough to stain the memory of a day. Jordan turned his head slightly and met Clayton's eyes just long enough to send a message. He smiled, tight, professional, but his eyes were hard. Clayton didn't return the gesture. He simply looked away, jaw clenched. Behind them, 2 rows back, a man in a navy jacket sipped from a cup of coffee, eyes scanning a paperback novel. Another passenger browsed the in-flight magazine. Everything looked normal, but what Jordan and Clayton didn't know was that not far from them, 4 federal agents sat in strategic positions across the cabin. Their presence wasn't public, and their mission wasn't related to anyone on this flight. It was an unrelated operation, a routine escort of classified cargo scheduled to be offloaded in Capitol View. None of them had any idea that their mission was about to take a sharp turn. A flight attendant named Milo passed down the aisle, checking seatbelts and tray tables. When he reached Clayton's row, he paused. The man's leather satchel, worn and bulging at the sides, was still resting on his lap. "Sir, I'll need you to place your bag under the seat or in the overhead compartment," Milo said gently, offering the practiced smile of someone who had repeated this instruction hundreds of times. Clayton didn't move. "It's fine where it is." "I understand, but for takeoff and landing—" "It's fine," Clayton repeated, his voice flat but laced with tension. Milo hesitated, eyes flicking toward the front galley. "All right, but once we reach cruising altitude, I'll need to check again." Jordan observed the exchange from the corner of his eye. The satchel caught his attention, not because of its presence, but because of Clayton's grip on it. The man's hand remained clenched around the strap, knuckles white. He wasn't just keeping the bag close, he was guarding it. Ezra tugged his hoodie's collar higher, trying to focus on his playlist. But the air felt heavier now. A low-grade pressure had begun to rise in the cabin, not from altitude, but from something unseen. Something about the way Clayton's eyes darted and the way his fingers flexed against the worn leather strap. Something that made Jordan's pulse quicken, even as his expression remained calm. "Dad," Ezra said again, barely audible. "He hasn't blinked in like a minute." Jordan turned slightly, just enough to catch another glance. Clayton wasn't looking anymore, but the tension in his posture hadn't eased. In fact, he now seemed to be pressing something inside his coat, beneath the flap of the satchel. Jordan's instincts, honed through years of boardroom negotiation and subtle power plays, screamed at him. But this wasn't business. This wasn't a metaphor. This was real. Farther back, Agent Harlan, tall, clean-shaven, with the posture of someone who never truly relaxed, noticed it too. He watched Clayton's movements from behind a half-folded newspaper, fingers tapping discreetly against his knee. He leaned slightly and whispered into a hidden mic under his collar. "Seat 3B, male, approximately 60. Possible concealed item. Keep eyes sharp." Jordan didn't hear that transmission, but he felt something shifting. The unease in the cabin wasn't imagined. It was growing. Milo passed by again, pausing at Jordan's row. He offered a polite nod, but there was tightness in his smile now, too. Jordan sat up straighter, his hand gently brushing Ezra's wrist. "Put your seatbelt back on," he said quietly, "and keep your eyes forward." Ezra obeyed, his pulse starting to race now, not because of anything he'd done, but because he could feel his father's calm beginning to harden into focus. That shift only happened when something was wrong. A flicker of motion across the aisle drew Jordan's attention again. Clayton was now subtly adjusting something inside the satchel, his fingers moving in short, precise motions. His lips moved faintly, as if whispering to himself. His eyes darted, once to Ezra, then forward toward the cockpit. In that moment, the hum of the engines seemed to drop. The quiet of the cabin grew colder, and Jordan understood. This man wasn't just angry. He was preparing something, planning something. Whatever it wasn't an outburst. It was an execution. Jordan didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stared at the man across the aisle, calculating. Sometimes the most dangerous turbulence comes from the seat beside you. Ezra stretched his arms as he stood in the narrow aisle, the gentle hum of the aircraft engines blending with the occasional clink of drink carts and muffled conversations. He took a few steps forward, glancing down the cabin before slowly making his way back to his seat. As he passed row 2, where the older man named Clayton Renshaw sat rigidly with a leather satchel resting on his lap, something stopped him. "You don't belong up here." The words were quiet, almost lost in the soft noise of the flight, but they cut through the air with the sting of a slap. Ezra halted mid-step, blinking as if to confirm he had heard right. His eyes shifted toward the source. Clayton sat motionless, his pale hands gripping the satchel a little too tightly. A thin, crooked smile crept across his face, but his eyes never met Ezra's directly. It was a smirk meant to provoke, not to invite conversation. Ezra didn't respond immediately. He stood there, unsure whether to confront the man or keep moving. His breath caught slightly in his chest, not from fear, but from a sudden awareness that something had shifted, something unspoken but heavy. He turned slowly, returned to his seat beside his father, and settled in without a word. Jordan noticed the tightness in his son's jaw. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly, his voice low and even. Ezra hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, just tired." Jordan studied him for a second longer, his instincts tugging, but he let it rest for now. From across the aisle, Clayton sat still, staring blankly ahead, but every few minutes his lips would move, barely audible to those nearby. "Some kids don't know their place," he muttered once, just loud enough to be heard by a young businessman seated behind him. The man frowned but said nothing, choosing instead to shift in his seat uncomfortably and pretend to read the in-flight magazine. The flight attendant, Milo, a calm and professional man in his 30s, made his rounds through the business class section. As he reached Clayton's row, he paused. "Sir, your bag needs to be stowed either under your seat or in the overhead compartment." Clayton barely looked up. "It's fine where it is." "I'm sorry, but it's regulation. We can't have loose items during flight." Clayton's fingers tightened around the handle of the bag. "I said it's fine," he repeated, this time with more force. Milo gave a brief nod, backing off for the moment, but not before exchanging a glance with a tall man seated near the exit row, Agent Harlan, one of the undercover federal officers. The agent, dressed like a casual traveler, raised his eyes from his book and subtly tilted his head, acknowledging the concern without drawing attention. His fingers casually touched his earpiece as he whispered into the small mic hidden in his collar. His eyes now locked on Clayton with a new intensity. Ezra leaned his head back against the seat, trying to lose himself in the soft rhythm of the music playing through his earbuds, but the incident gnawed at him. He could still hear the words, "You don't belong up here," echoing in his mind, not just as a statement, but as a challenge. He had faced subtle jabs before, the lingering stares, the dismissive glances, the comments masked as jokes, but this was different. This was direct. Jordan noticed his son's fidgeting, the way his hands clutched the blanket a little too tightly. He reached over and gently squeezed Ezra's shoulder. "You're not alone," he said quietly. Ezra didn't respond, but the touch grounded him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was brewing. Across the aisle, Clayton began to mutter again, his eyes darting toward Ezra, then back to his satchel. His foot tapped rhythmically against the floor, and his breathing quickened. It wasn't enough to cause alarm yet, but it was enough for Agent Harlan to make a note in his mental ledger. The man was nervous, agitated, and his refusal to stow the bag had now become more than stubbornness. It was a red flag. Another attendant, Jace, stepped up to Milo and whispered, "That guy with the satchel, anything off?" Milo nodded slightly. "Won't let go of it. Didn't like being asked twice. It's not normal." Jace glanced toward Clayton, then at the other passengers. Most were oblivious, tapping on screens, sipping sodas, chatting about connecting flights. But the air felt heavier now. Unseen currents of unease flowed beneath the surface like static before a storm. Clayton shifted in his seat again, clutching the bag tighter as if it were part of him. His eyes occasionally flicked to Ezra, then to the seat pocket in front of him, then to nothing at all. His lips moved silently, and for a brief moment Milo caught a glimpse of something flickering in his expression, something darker than defiance, something close to hate. Agent Harlan now sat forward in his seat, unbuckled. He didn't reach for his badge. Not yet, but his eyes never left the man with the satchel. His thumb hovered near a discreet button sewn into his jacket lining, an alert trigger. 2 rows back, Agent Bryce received a silent vibration through his wristband. He looked up, subtly turned his head toward Clayton, and began watching. Jordan finally spoke again, voice low. "Ezra, what did that man say to you earlier?" Ezra hesitated, then spoke just above a whisper. He said, "I don't belong up here." Jordan's jaw clenched slightly, but his voice stayed calm. "Did he touch you? Threaten you?" "No," Ezra said. "Just looked, like he wanted to." Jordan looked across the aisle. Clayton was now still again, breathing slow but erratic, eyes closed. But there was nothing peaceful about him. The plane's lights dimmed slightly as the flight entered a cruising altitude. A soft chime rang out, but even in the calm, Jordan felt the air shift. Something wasn't right. Milo made one more pass, this time not asking Clayton to move the bag. Instead, he simply noted it, then walked past, stopping briefly beside Agent Harlan, whose fingers tapped twice against his knee, an unspoken signal. The agents were on alert. Ezra leaned into his seat, trying to focus on his music, but the rhythm of the plane no longer felt soothing. His father glanced at him, then across the aisle, then toward the flight attendants, calculating, preparing. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The satchel, the muttered words, the stare, the refusal. The tea kettle was on the flame, and it was starting to scream. Respect isn't always taken. Sometimes it's threatened. Clayton's hand slipped into the leather satchel with practiced ease, his fingers moving like they'd done this before. From his aisle seat, Agent Harlan's eyes narrowed. He caught the subtle motion, the way Clayton shielded the action with his elbow, his body curling just slightly inward, as if he hoped the surrounding eyes wouldn't notice. But Harlan noticed. He leaned forward in his seat, the low hum of the aircraft almost masking his quiet whisper into the concealed comms mic wrapped around his wrist. "He's reaching," Harlan said calmly, but his voice carried a current of urgency. Clayton's knuckles tightened as he pulled something free. What appeared to be an ordinary silver pen glinted briefly under the cabin light, but there was something odd about the way he gripped it, not to write, but to strike. Ezra, oblivious, had just returned to his seat moments earlier, earbuds in, his head resting lightly against the window as soft music played. He didn't see Clayton rise, didn't see the flash of movement in the corner of his vision, didn't hear the faint snap of a disguised blade emerging from the pen's barrel. But Jordan did. The moment Clayton stood, barking something harsh and venomous under his breath, Jordan's instincts took over. Clayton's voice cut through the cabin's gentle murmur like a blade through paper. "You don't belong here," he shouted, lunging forward, his hand driving the weapon through the air toward Ezra. Passengers gasped. One woman, 2 rows back, screamed. A tray of plastic cups clattered to the floor. The hum of the engine was instantly drowned out by human panic. Jordan didn't think, he moved, his body thrust across the narrow space between seats, shoving Ezra sideways and against the fuselage wall. His arm shot up, intercepting the downward swing of Clayton's hand. The blade grazed his sleeve, slicing through the fabric with a whisper of tearing thread. The edge didn't find skin, but it was close. The movement knocked Clayton off balance just enough. That's when the agents rose. Agent Harlan moved first, pushing past the passenger in front of him with speed that didn't match his calm demeanor just moments before. His badge flashed only briefly from beneath his jacket before his hand was already reaching for Clayton's wrist. The weapon clattered to the floor as Harlan tackled Clayton sideways into the aisle. 2 rows back, Agent Bryce stood in one fluid motion, pulling a compact sidearm from his holster. He didn't aim, yet. Instead, he positioned himself between Clayton and the front of the cabin, shielding the pilot's door. His eyes scanned for accomplices. From the back of the plane, the other 2 agents, Quaid and Mendez, were already on the move. They moved swiftly but deliberately, weaving through the stunned passengers who had frozen mid-breath. Clayton howled as Harlan pinned him down. He kicked, tried to twist his arm free, but the agent's grip didn't loosen. "This isn't over," Clayton yelled, his voice full of rage and something more twisted, conviction. Jordan held Ezra close, pulling him upright and shielding his son with his body. He could feel the rapid thump of Ezra's heart through his shirt. The boy's face was pale, his mouth slightly open, eyes wide and staring, not at Clayton, but at the red line across his father's torn sleeve. "Dad, he had a knife," Ezra whispered. "I know," Jordan said, never taking his eyes off the chaos unfolding in the aisle. The flight attendants had frozen at first, unsure if this was a hijacking or something worse. But Milo, the one who had confronted Clayton about the satchel earlier, regained composure and moved toward the back to assist with crowd control. Passengers began to whisper. "Is this a terrorist? Did someone record that? I saw him go for the kid. Did anyone else see?" A man across the aisle had his phone pointed downward, camera active. Whether he had filmed the entire thing or just the aftermath wasn't clear, but it was clear enough. This would not stay contained. Clayton continued to yell even as Agent Quaid helped bind his wrists with reinforced zip ties. He spat toward the floor, his face twisted with hatred. "This is what you call justice?" he snarled. "They don't belong in first class." Agent Mendez shoved a cloth over his mouth to quiet the rant. "You don't get to decide who belongs anywhere," he said coldly. Jordan finally allowed himself to breathe. His hand trembled slightly as he ran it down Ezra's arm to make sure he hadn't been cut. The boy was shaken but unharmed. Jordan nodded once, locking eyes with Agent Harlan as the man stood upright, keeping one boot on Clayton's shoulder. "Thank you," Jordan said quietly. Harlan gave a curt nod, his jaw tight. "You okay?" "We are now," Jordan replied. But inside he was already calculating. This wasn't just a deranged passenger. The precision of the blade's disguise, the timing, the bile in Clayton's voice, it all pointed to something deeper. This hadn't been spontaneous. This was targeted. As the plane stabilized again and Clayton was dragged to the rear under guard, passengers began to shift in their seats, some whispering, others too stunned to speak. Jordan leaned back, still holding Ezra close. For the first time since takeoff, he noticed just how quiet the cabin had become. It wasn't the hum of peace, it was the silence that follows a near disaster. And in that silence, the weight of the moment sank in. He had nearly lost his son. Clayton had no idea who he was dealing with. No idea that his act of violence had taken place on the one flight protected by 4 federal agents. No idea that his attack would ripple far beyond this cabin. He thought it would be easy to threaten a boy. He didn't see the storm coming. Agent Harlan moved fast. In a blur of instinct and training, he lunged across the narrow aisle just as Clayton rose from his seat, arm cocked back, blade glinting under the fluorescent cabin lights. The disguised penknife slipped forward, aimed straight for Ezra's chest, but it never reached him. Harlan's body collided with Clayton's midair, knocking the man sideways with enough force to send both crashing into the empty seat beside Jordan. The sound was sickening. A human thud, followed by the sharp clatter of metal hitting the floor. Passengers screamed. One woman in the row behind gasped so loudly it sounded like a sob. Another fumbled to press the flight attendant button, her finger trembling. The once quiet cabin erupted into chaos. Trays fell. Drinks spilled. Someone shouted for help, and others ducked beneath their seats as if turbulence had suddenly taken on a human form. Jordan didn't waste a second. His arms wrapped around Ezra, yanking him toward the window seat and shielding his son with his own body. Ezra froze, stunned, his eyes fixed on the violent tangle in the aisle. His headphones hung loosely around his neck, the music still playing, an eerie contrast to the real-world noise around him. "Stay down," Jordan whispered harshly, his voice tight with panic and resolve. Agent Bryce, seated several rows behind, was already moving. He surged forward, drawing a compact weapon from beneath his jacket, his movements sharp and efficient. "Federal agent, stay seated," he barked, planting himself in the middle of the aisle, one arm outstretched to secure a perimeter while keeping an eye on the threat. Clayton, despite being slammed to the floor, thrashed violently beneath Harlan. He screamed hoarsely, voice raw and filled with venom. "They don't belong up here," he roared. "This is sacred ground, purity in the skies." His face twisted with fury, lips curled back like a cornered animal. Spittle flew from his mouth as he shouted again, "Cleansing the air, one by one." Harlan wrestled to pin Clayton's arms behind his back, his knee pressed against the man's shoulder blades. "Weapon recovered," he called out calmly into his earpiece. "Subject is hostile. Repeat, hostile and ideologically driven." From the back of the cabin, Agents Quaid and Mendez charged forward, weaving past confused passengers and panicked crew. Mendez reached the scene first, pulling a pair of reinforced cuffs from his belt. Quaid covered the perimeter, his eyes scanning every face in the nearby rows, hand resting near his sidearm. "Don't move. Everyone remain seated," Quaid ordered, his tone stern but controlled. Flight attendants stood frozen near the galley, unsure whether to help or retreat. One of them, Milo, finally managed to pull down the cabin intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay calm. We have a security situation being handled by federal agents. Remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened," Milo announced, voice slightly shaking but determined. Passengers, though still stunned, began obeying. Some crouched low, others stared ahead blankly, their expressions mirrors of disbelief and fear. Jordan slowly sat up, never letting go of Ezra, who still hadn't spoken. The boy's hands gripped his father's jacket with white-knuckled intensity. His breathing was shallow, chest rising and falling in stuttering rhythm. Jordan's mind raced. It could have ended so differently if Harlan had hesitated, if Clayton had moved faster, if Ezra had been standing a few inches to the left. "Dad," Ezra finally whispered, his voice fragile. "Why did he—" "I don't know," Jordan replied quietly, brushing his hand over Ezra's hair. "But you're safe. That's what matters right now." Behind them, the agents finished securing Clayton. Blood trickled from his temple, likely from where he'd hit the armrest, but his eyes were wide, unrepentant, wild with something deeper than rage. It wasn't personal. It was something colder, bigger. "Pack's already watching," Clayton muttered under his breath, directed toward no one. "He'll be pleased." Mendez turned toward Harlan. "That name again. We've heard that before." "Yeah," Harlan responded grimly. "We'll flag it." Just then, a phone's shutter clicked. Across the aisle, a young man discreetly angled his phone away after capturing the moment Clayton was restrained. He lowered it quickly, face pale but curious. A few taps, a flicker of the upload bar, and the footage was already leaving the confines of the cabin. The agents didn't notice. They were too focused on containment. Within minutes, the tight cabin space settled into a strained silence. People whispered. A baby cried softly at the back. Others just stared, at Clayton, at the agents, or at the empty seat where normalcy had been ripped out like a faulty wire. Ezra stayed silent. Jordan stayed close. The blade had been inches away. Inches. But those inches held lifetimes of difference. It was the kind of gap only courage, training, and an ounce of luck could bridge. As Mendez walked past, he gave Jordan a short nod of respect. "You kept calm. That helps more than you know." Jordan nodded back, but his jaw was tight. His mind wasn't on his calmness. It was on how easily it had all happened, on how his son could have been bleeding on this floor. He looked at Ezra again, trying to read the boy's shaken face. The trauma had taken root, quiet and fast. The danger had passed, yes, but the damage had already been done. Some attacks aren't just physical, they're meant to scar the soul. The cabin was a still ocean after a storm, quiet but far from calm. Clayton Renshaw sat hunched and cuffed in the last row, his arms restrained tightly behind his back by reinforced plastic ties. A federal agent named Mendez stood over him, silent and unmoved, his expression a study in cold vigilance. Clayton muttered under his breath, his words garbled, his eyes burning with a manic light that refused to die out. Though the threat had been neutralized, the cabin felt changed. Every passenger bore the invisible mark of having come too close to something unspeakable. Flight attendants moved swiftly down the aisle, checking on shaken travelers and whispering reassurance in strained voices. One of them, Milo, who had earlier confronted Clayton about the satchel, passed by Jordan and Ezra with a faint nod of concern. Jordan barely acknowledged it. His full attention was on his son. Ezra sat stiffly in his seat, earbuds dangling unused around his neck, hands gripping the armrests as if letting go might make the past few minutes return. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and though his face showed no tears, his eyes shimmered with unshed panic. Jordan reached over, placing a steady hand on Ezra's shoulder. The boy didn't speak, but he didn't flinch either. His body accepted the contact even if his mind was still somewhere between fear and confusion. "You're all right," Jordan murmured, keeping his voice low. "You're safe now. I'm right here." Ezra nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes fixed on the seatback in front of him. Jordan could see the tremor in his jaw, tight, restrained. His son had always been quiet, composed beyond his years, but this was a silence forged from shock. Jordan leaned closer, his voice firmer now. "Look at me." Ezra's gaze slowly shifted to his father's. The moment held. "We made it through," Jordan said, "but we're not done yet." Just then, a man in a charcoal suit eased into the aisle seat beside Jordan. Agent Harlan. He held a small black folder in his hand, its edges worn. His badge, though tucked under his jacket, peeked out just enough for Jordan to recognize the federal seal. "Mr. Braxton," Harlan said quietly, "we need to speak." Jordan gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "Of course." The agent glanced toward Ezra, who was now listening, though still without a word. "Your son is brave. What happened wasn't random." Jordan's brows knit together. "You mean he was targeted?" "Possibly," Harlan replied. He opened the folder and flipped to a printed dossier page. It contained a grainy headshot of Clayton Renshaw, along with a list of aliases and scattered locations. Clayton passed through security with forged credentials, outdated identification from a now-defunct government subdivision, and a fabricated medical exemption. He claimed he couldn't walk unassisted, which allowed him to bypass secondary screening. TSA missed it. He exploited a gap we've been tracking for months. Jordan exhaled slowly, fury and calculation mixing behind his eyes. "Was he your target?" Harlan shook his head. Ironically, our team was on this flight for another surveillance operation, completely unrelated. But once Agent Bryce spotted Clayton palming that satchel too tight, we diverted attention. Jordan looked over Harlan's shoulder, locking eyes with Clayton for a single beat across the cabin. The older man sneered back, bruised but defiant. The arrogance in that stare chilled Jordan more than the weapon had. "He knew exactly who he was going after," Harlan continued. "He didn't just bring a blade. He brought ideology." Jordan's mouth tightened. "You're telling me this wasn't just a racist lunatic on a plane?" "No, sir. He's believed to be affiliated with an underground cell," Harlan replied. "We haven't confirmed everything yet, but it looks like a group focused on targeting high-profile black professionals, especially those in tech, media, and law. They thrive on shock, public fear, psychological warfare disguised as isolated incidents." Ezra's head finally turned fully toward them. "So, he picked us?" Harlan didn't look away. "He picked your father, son, and you were collateral." Jordan clenched his fist on the tray table, steady but tense. His voice was low and even, but the fire behind it was unmistakable. "Why now? Why us?" "Because you're visible," Harlan said. "You represent something they hate. Power, visibility, control over future systems, AI, cybersecurity, voice. These aren't just industries anymore. They're the front lines." For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside the window, the clouds drifted by like nothing had happened. But inside the cabin, Jordan felt the shift. This wasn't just about a father and son nearly stabbed on a plane. It was a signal, a message, one meant to rattle him off course. A chime rang overhead. The captain's voice came through, composed but brisk. "Ladies and gentlemen, the situation has been contained. Federal authorities have secured the threat. We will not be diverting the aircraft. Please remain in your seats, and thank you for your cooperation." A few murmurs followed, scattered applause from the rear, but the energy remained heavy, as if no one wanted to break the silence too loudly. The kind of hush that comes not from calm, but from witnessing something too real to dismiss. Jordan turned back to Ezra, who now looked slightly more grounded. "Still want to be in this world?" Jordan asked gently. Ezra stared at him, blinking once. "Even more than before." Jordan smiled faintly, then sat back, folding his arms. The folder still sat on Harlan's lap, its pages a quiet threat. The lights dimmed again as the cabin prepared for descent, but neither Jordan nor Ezra relaxed fully. Their flight had changed course in every way except direction. He boarded to share progress. He landed carrying proof of danger. The plane touched down on the tarmac at Capitol View Regional with a hard jolt that startled even those who had remained calm during the chaos. The cabin was silent now, save for the low hum of the engines winding down and the occasional click of seatbelts being unfastened. The weight of what had just occurred lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, thick, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. Outside, flashing red and blue lights lit up the early evening sky. A convoy of black SUVs and federal transport vans stood waiting near the terminal's edge, flanked by armed personnel in dark tactical gear. No announcement was made. There were no routine exit instructions. This was not a normal landing. The cockpit doors remained closed, but movement from within hinted at the serious conversations unfolding between the pilots and federal agents. Clayton Renshaw, still restrained and seething, was the first to be moved. Two agents gripped his arms tightly, dragging him from his seat while his feet scraped against the floor. His voice cracked through the silence, ranting about purity and legacies in tones that bordered on maniacal. His eyes darted around the cabin like a caged animal, searching for an audience, desperate to reclaim the control he had lost. The agents didn't speak to him. Their faces remained expressionless, their movements swift and deliberate as they shoved him down the jet bridge toward the waiting authorities. Jordan Braxton watched him go, his fists clenched, his jaw rigid. Every fiber of his being screamed for calm, but inside, something darker stirred. Rage, fear, resolve, all tangled in a knot he couldn't yet untie. Beside him, Ezra sat stiffly, his shoulders hunched, eyes staring straight ahead. He hadn't spoken a word since the attack. The headphones still dangled from his lap, forgotten. Jordan reached over and placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "You all right?" he asked softly. Ezra blinked, then nodded, though his face betrayed uncertainty. His mouth opened as if to say something, but the words didn't come. Jordan didn't press. Instead, he glanced toward the rear, where Agent Harlan stood near the galley, speaking into a secure phone with a low, clipped tone. Another agent, Mendez, motioned for them to stand. "We're moving you now," he said, voice calm but edged with urgency. As they exited the aircraft through a side jet bridge, a wall of cameras flashed from the terminal windows. Reporters pressed against the glass, phones raised, mouths moving in a frenzy behind the soundproof barriers. News of the attack had already leaked. Someone had uploaded the in-flight video and the internet had done the rest. What was supposed to be a quiet arrival had become a media storm. Jordan and Ezra were quickly escorted into a black SUV waiting beyond the security perimeter. The windows were tinted pitch black. Inside, the air was cold, the silence stifling. Agent Bryce took the front passenger seat, rifle slung across his chest, while Agent Quaid drove. No one spoke for the first few minutes. Jordan's phone buzzed in his pocket again and again. He pulled it out to find dozens of missed calls and messages. His inbox overflowed, texts from fellow CEOs, journalists requesting statements, even a message from the mayor's chief of staff requesting a private briefing. He scrolled silently, his face blank. But deep down, he knew what this meant. This wasn't just an isolated act of hate, it was a warning. And maybe more were coming. Ezra broke the silence with a question that hit like a weight dropped from the sky. Was he just some crazy man, or was he sent? His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but clear. Jordan met his son's eyes through the rearview mirror. "We're going to find out," he replied, steady but with a steel edge beneath the calm. Agent Bryce turned slightly in his seat. "We have reason to believe Clayton's not a lone actor. His background's being pulled now, but there are affiliations, groups with disturbing agendas." He paused, glancing back. "This might not be the end." Ezra shifted uncomfortably. Jordan stared out the window, watching the city skyline rise in the distance. Everything he'd planned for, his keynote, the tech summit, the discussions on AI policy, now felt distant, trivial. His purpose had shifted in a matter of seconds, redefined by the glint of a hidden blade and the hateful words of a man who thought his act would go unnoticed. The SUV came to a stop beneath the canopy of a private hotel entrance. Security guards flanked the doors. As the agents cleared the way, Jordan turned to Ezra. "You don't have to come to the summit tomorrow. We can change our plans." Ezra hesitated, then shook his head. "If we disappear, don't they win?" Jordan looked at him with something close to pride, tempered by concern. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They do." Inside the hotel suite, they were greeted by a private security liaison and a communications officer. The television was already tuned to a breaking news report. Footage from the plane played on loop. Clayton's outburst, the federal agent's takedown, and still frames of Jordan shielding his son were plastered across every major channel. Commentary ran beneath in bold text: Tech CEO targeted mid-flight. Federal agents foil attempted in-air attack. Terror in the skies? Victor Miles, their assigned legal advisor, arrived moments later, breathless and holding a secure folder. "We need to talk," he said, waving the agents to stay nearby. They sat at the conference table as Victor laid out classified information recently shared by the Bureau. Clayton Renshaw had been on a watch list, albeit low priority, for fringe associations with a white nationalist group known as Gray Trace. Until today, he had no criminal record, but further digging revealed encrypted messages and suspicious travel patterns. Jordan listened in silence, his fingers steepled before him. "So, this wasn't random," he said flatly. "No," Victor answered. "We believe you were the target. Your name was mentioned in a few flagged communications, coded, but it's there. Ezra wasn't collateral. He was part of it." The room fell into a heavy silence. Ezra swallowed hard. "They knew I'd be with him?" Victor hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Jordan rose from his chair and walked toward the window. Capitol View glowed in the distance, but it no longer felt like a city of opportunity. It felt like a battleground. He clenched his jaw. "I was going to talk about machine learning and smart logistics," he murmured. "But now—" Victor stepped closer. "You could still give the speech, but we can issue a statement instead. Keep it brief. Stay out of sight until this dies down." Jordan turned around, the fire in his eyes unmistakable. "I'm not hiding. Not now." Ezra stood beside him, his voice calm but resolute. "Then I'm not hiding either." Victor looked at them both, then gave a slow nod. "Understood, but be ready. Once you speak, there's no taking it back." Jordan nodded. He already knew. Tomorrow wouldn't be just a tech summit. It would be a reckoning. The question now wasn't whether he would speak, but what truth he'd unleash when he did. Some landings don't mark the end of a journey. They're just the start of a battle. The moment Agent Harlan closed the hotel room door behind him, the air shifted. Silence held the space like a loaded spring. Jordan Braxton stood by the window, arms crossed, his reflection blending into the Capitol View skyline behind the glass. He hadn't changed out of his suit from the flight, though the fabric was wrinkled and his shirt still bore a faint mark where Ezra had grabbed him during the struggle. His eyes didn't blink much, fixed, calculating, worn. Agent Harlan broke the silence first, setting down a sealed folder on the desk near the bed. "Clayton Renshaw isn't just some unstable loner. We've linked him to a cell within a larger extremist network called Gray Trace." Jordan turned, eyebrows low. "That's the group tied to the cyber attacks on Senator Ewell's campaign, isn't it?" Harlan nodded grimly. "And the break-in at the community center in Flint? We believe their aim is psychological disruption, strategically timed threats, staged to look like random outbursts but engineered to send a message. Their focus is high-profile black leaders. You weren't an accident. Neither was your son." A chill crept through the room. Ezra, who'd been sitting quietly on the couch in the corner, looked up. He didn't say anything yet, but his jaw tensed. Victor Miles, A clean-cut legal advisor with wire-rimmed glasses and a sharp crease in his blazer stepped forward from the far side of the room. "Jordan, listen to me," he said, voice low but urgent. "You can't go to that summit tomorrow. They've already made their move. The next one might be worse." Jordan's fingers tightened against his arms, knuckles whitening. "So we just disappear? Hide in the corner and pretend this didn't happen?" "I'm telling you to prioritize safety," Victor replied firmly. "You have a public profile. If they're trying to break your momentum, this is how they start. You've seen the threats escalate." Jordan exhaled slowly through his nose, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the city lights flickered like stars caught in a nervous pulse. His mind raced, not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility. How many others had been threatened before him? How many had backed down? Victor added, "You have a chance to de-escalate. We can delay the keynote, make it virtual, let the heat die down." But Jordan barely heard him anymore. His thoughts had turned inward, back to the flight, to the blade, to Ezra's wide eyes as the attacker lunged. The smell of metal and panic still clung to his skin. Then, unexpectedly, a voice came from the corner of the room. Quiet, but steady. "If we don't show up, they win." Ezra. Everyone turned. The boy's voice was calm, but his shoulders were stiff with something deeper than defiance. His eyes, still bearing the shadow of fear, locked onto his father's. Jordan blinked as if startled awake. He studied his son for a long moment. Ezra didn't flinch. That was the moment Jordan made his choice, not from pride, not from anger, but from something older, harder. A belief passed down quietly from men who'd walked into danger and refused to bow. He stepped away from the window and sat at the edge of the desk, looking at Victor. "No," he said simply. "I'm going to the summit, but I'm not giving the speech they expect." Victor looked alarmed. "Jordan." "I'm not talking about server infrastructure or neural frameworks tomorrow," Jordan interrupted. "I'm going to talk about what just happened. About Clayton. About what my son almost faced. About Gray Trace and the systems that allow this poison to spread unchecked." He leaned forward, planting both hands on the desk. "I've been building things my whole life. Software, systems, solutions. But what happened on that plane didn't come from a bug. It came from something designed to stay hidden, something built to rot people from the inside out. We can't fix that by staying quiet." Agent Harlan gave a short nod, respect evident in the gesture. "We'll make the security adjustments. You'll have protection, more than usual." Victor hesitated, rubbing his temple. "You understand the kind of storm you're inviting, don't you?" Jordan stood. "I've lived in the storm, Victor. I just never invited others into it before. Tomorrow, I'm done waiting for it to pass." Ezra watched his father rise, a quiet strength settling over his features. For the first time since the flight, his spine straightened fully. Jordan reached for his bag, pulling out the speech notes he'd planned for months. Pages of charts, technical analysis, AI innovation models. He stared at them for a long moment, then folded them neatly and set them aside. "I'll write a new one tonight," he said, "and this time it's going to mean something more than code and metrics." Victor sighed but didn't argue again. The decision was made. Outside, the city glowed unaware, but inside the suite, the night took on a new purpose. Jordan glanced once more at his son, and Ezra met his gaze with steady calm. He boarded a plane as a CEO, but now he stood as something more. If that moment made your blood boil and your heart ache, don't stay silent. Subscribe and become a member, because standing against hate is how we protect the innocent. Jordan stepped up to the podium, the polished wood cool under his hands, and stared out at the sea of faces in the grand auditorium. The lights overhead were bright, focused entirely on him, yet he felt none of their warmth. Cameras flashed. The audience, made up of innovators, executives, politicians, and media personnel, rose in unison, an automatic standing ovation reserved for tech pioneers and keynote speakers. Jordan Braxton, the CEO of Arclean Systems, was both. But today, the applause sounded distant, hollow. He didn't raise a hand to signal for silence. He simply began. "Yesterday, on Flight 912, he said clearly, the microphone capturing the calm weight of his words, a man pulled a knife on my 17-year-old son." The applause died instantly. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Heads tilted, pens paused. Somewhere near the second row, a man lowered his phone camera slowly, unsure if he had heard correctly. Jordan's voice didn't tremble. The weapon was disguised, the attack was real, and it was not random. He let the silence hang for a moment. Then he inhaled deeply, his first unscripted breath in weeks, and continued. That man had targeted us long before we ever boarded the flight. My son, Ezra, was in his seat, headphones on, unaware that someone 2 rows away saw him not as a person but as a symbol he wanted to erase. A hush blanketed the room. No one reached for their coffee cups. No one whispered. Behind Jordan, the projection screen flickered with the logo for the National Innovation Council but remained untouched. He had not asked them to load any slides. Jordan stepped slightly forward. 4 federal agents stopped what could have been a tragedy, and I'm grateful for their presence, grateful beyond words. But I have to ask, why did it take 4 agents on an unrelated assignment to stop something that should never have happened in the first place? The weight of the question seemed to press down on the walls of the auditorium. Even the technicians in the shadows froze mid-adjustment. Then Jordan did what no one expected. He deviated from every prepared word. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a folded document. With a glance down to collect himself, he read from the page. This is an excerpt from an internal report we obtained. One documenting cyber intrusions, phishing attempts, and sabotage incidents aimed at Arcline systems over the past 3 years. Almost all of them were anonymous, many dismissed as minor breaches. But every one of them came after we launched diversity partnerships, or hired new black executives, or released public statements in support of equity. Murmurs began to bubble across the room. Some looked to their colleagues. A few executives lowered their heads in quiet recognition. We've traced several of these attacks to a group calling themselves Gray Trace, Jordan said, looking up again, locking eyes with the audience. They're not just hackers. They are organized, deliberate, and they've been targeting black-led tech firms across the country through intimidation, false audits, spam floods, and even internal sabotage. His voice sharpened just slightly. What happened on Flight 912 wasn't an accident. It was a message, and I won't pretend it didn't reach me. The room felt colder now, like the truth had sucked the air from it. A few reporters near the back were typing frantically. One of them raised his hand, but Jordan wasn't ready for questions. Not yet. He took a small step back from the microphone and surveyed the crowd. My original talk today was about scalable AI for municipal systems. We were going to discuss how predictive algorithms can help reduce waste and increase sustainability in city planning, and we'll still get there. But today, I needed to speak plainly, because what we build, no matter how advanced, is meaningless if we don't also build systems that protect the people inside them. A slow, deliberate applause began. One person at first, then several more. It wasn't explosive. It was measured, acknowledging truth, bearing the weight of it. Jordan nodded once and folded his notes again. I never thought I'd have to defend my family's right to exist safely in the sky. I never thought a tech summit would become a platform for something more urgent than innovation. But I'm here. We're here. And we won't be silent. He paused one final time, let the moment breathe, then finished. Truth, when spoken on a platform meant for progress, becomes a weapon stronger than fear. As Jordan stepped off the stage, the sound of applause rang through the auditorium like a crashing wave. Flashbulbs erupted from media cameras while murmurs of astonishment spread across the hall. Jordan's hands were steady as he walked behind the curtain, but inside, his heart beat with a quiet storm, one part adrenaline, another part unease. The speech had gone exactly as planned, maybe even better. He had spoken his truth with clarity, with restraint, with power. But in his gut, he knew the cost of truth spoken too loudly, and that cost was coming. Victor Miles was waiting for him in the green room. He didn't smile, didn't clap, just handed Jordan a folded piece of paper. They didn't waste any time, Victor said grimly. Jordan opened the note. It was short, typed, and unsigned. 2 confirmed threats, you and your son. Cease visibility or consequences will escalate. Jordan's fingers curled tightly around the page. Do the agents know? He asked, voice low but firm. They've already moved, Victor nodded. Harlan's setting up 24-hour protection. Ezra won't leave your side without coverage, but that's not all. Victor tapped his phone screen and handed it over. A muted video began playing. It was grainy, recorded through an encrypted channel from what appeared to be a dimly lit room. A man's voice was speaking off camera, praising Clayton as a patriot who acted when no one else would. Faces flickered on the edge of shadows, some covered, others wearing gray caps with a faint insignia that looked like wings twisted into a symbol. The next part of the video hit like ice in the veins. A different voice, sharper and colder, came through. Jordan Braxton is now elevated to priority status. We watch, we wait, we strike when his light blinds the wrong eyes. Victor's voice was tight. That came from their internal forum. The speaker is known only by one name, Ghost Reel. No image, no footprint, but intelligence says he, or whoever he is, has been behind 5 coordinated attacks in the last 3 years. Jordan stared at the screen for a long moment before slowly setting the phone down. The air in the room felt heavier now, thicker with the presence of a shadow they couldn't see but could feel all too well. "Then it's not about Clayton," Jordan said quietly. "It never was." Victor shook his head. "He was a symptom. This is the infection." Jordan walked toward the window overlooking the plaza outside. Cameras were still set up. Crowds were dispersing. The city moved on, unaware that the stage they'd just applauded was now a battlefield. His mind turned to Ezra, to the terrified look in his son's eyes during the flight, to the silence that followed, to the strength he had shown this morning by standing beside him. "I can't just walk away," Jordan muttered. "I won't." Victor sighed, walking over. "Then we fight, but not alone." That afternoon, Jordan reached out. He called Elijah Tay, CEO of a rival tech firm who had once received a severed thumb drive with threatening messages. He messaged Lionel Carter, a senator who'd quietly pulled his grandson from public school after receiving anonymous threats. He sent encrypted memos to leaders of 3 major media networks, urging them to join forces and shine a coordinated light on Gray Trace's network. The responses came swiftly. Some were cautious, some outright afraid, but others were angry, ready, tired of silence. In one call, Lionel Carter leaned into the mic and said, "You've drawn fire, but you're not the only one standing in it. Maybe it's time we burn down the lies together." Later that night, Jordan sat on the edge of the hotel bed, Ezra fast asleep nearby. The boy's breathing was soft, steady, but his fists were curled, even in sleep. Jordan leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The patterns in the plaster reminded him of flight maps, curved arcs, and invisible destinations. He didn't know where this would lead, but he knew this. The enemy wasn't just hiding in forums or shadowed rooms. The enemy wore politeness as armor and spoke in code. But now it had a name, a voice, and it had declared war. He rose quietly, walked to the desk, and opened his laptop. Dozens of messages poured in, some from allies, some from strangers, some filled with venom. But he didn't flinch. He typed out a public statement. Short, focused, unapologetic. The attack on Flight 912 was not isolated, it was the symptom of a larger disease. Gray Trace must be exposed, not just as a threat to people of color, but as a threat to the very idea of a free, safe society. We will not be silent. He hit send. The light from the screen reflected in his eyes, calm, unshaken, and lit with purpose. Outside, across the city, somewhere far from the safety of glass walls and guarded floors, another screen flickered on. A masked user opened Jordan's post. The cursor hovered over his name. A file opened. Jordan's image, Ezra's too. It was updated, stamped with red. Target, confirmed. Status, priority. And behind it, a line of silent watchers waited. Jordan didn't know exactly where the next strike would come from, but he was certain of one thing now. The plane may have landed, but the fight had just taken off. The knock came just as the city lights outside began to flicker into view, casting long shadows across the balcony where Jordan and Ezra sat in silence. The moment had been heavy with unspoken words. Ezra had asked the question not with anger, but with something far deeper, fatigue. His voice had cracked slightly, a quiet fracture in the boy's usually calm tone. "Why don't you just give up the spotlight and go home?" Jordan didn't answer right away. He looked out over the glimmering skyline of Capitol View, fingers gently drumming against the armrest of his chair. The sky was wide and dark, but beneath it pulsed the weight of a country watching, some with hope, others with venom. After a moment, he turned to his son and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Because if we don't stand in the light," Jordan said, his voice calm but firm, "they'll keep doing it in the dark." Ezra nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the distance. It was the kind of nod that held more questions than answers. He didn't say anything else, and maybe he didn't need to. But then came the knock. 3 sharp raps that broke the stillness like a hammer to glass. Jordan stood quickly, body stiffening. Ezra rose too, instinctively stepping behind him. The door opened to reveal Agent Harlan, dressed in a dark gray blazer, eyes shadowed with exhaustion and urgency. In his hand, he held a sealed manila envelope. "I need to speak with you," Harlan said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The agent's voice was tight, clipped, the way it got when something was serious. Jordan closed the door behind him, his expression shifting from concern to steel. Ezra watched from across the room, his fingers clenched into the sleeves of his hoodie. Harlan didn't sit. He opened the envelope and handed Jordan a set of documents, flight schedules, event listings, and a printed list of names. "This was intercepted from a Gray Trace communication hub late last night," Harlan explained. "Encrypted channel. Took us hours to break. It's a list of upcoming events and flights, all believed to be soft targets." Jordan scanned the list with practiced eyes. At first, nothing stood out. Business leaders, keynote speakers, conference panels, but then his fingers froze midway down the page. His breath caught. Ezra Braxton, scheduled flight, Port Del Mar to Halvern Tech Expo. Time, to be determined. The flyer hit the stage with a soft thump, barely louder than a shuffled footstep, but the effect was instant. A hush fell over the crowd. Cameras stopped clicking. Reporters froze mid-question. For a split second, it was as if time held its breath. Then, someone screamed. It wasn't because of what had landed. It was the not knowing. The dread that maybe it wasn't just paper. The flyer, crumpled and thrown from deep within the crowd, could have been anything. A warning, a device, a trigger. The chaos that erupted afterward proved it didn't need to be deadly to spread fear. "Down, now!" Agent Quaid's voice sliced through the rising noise. Within seconds, black-suited agents swarmed the stage, surrounding Jordan and Ezra with practiced urgency. The podium tipped over as one agent pulled Jordan away by the arm, while another covered Ezra with his body and rushed him toward the armored vehicle parked near the lot. The press conference had been Jordan's idea, his statement to the world that neither he nor his son would cower in shadows. He had arranged it in the open-air plaza outside the Capitol View Media Center, flanked by tall flagpoles and concrete barriers. The backdrop had been symbolic, a skyline of progress, a platform of resistance. But in that moment, the symbols crumbled beneath the weight of a deeper, invisible threat. Inside the armored van, Ezra sat shaking, eyes darting toward the bulletproof glass. Jordan sat beside him, jaw clenched, holding back the wave of rage building in his chest. "I didn't see who threw it," Ezra said, voice low as if speaking too loudly might trigger something worse. His knuckles were pale from how tightly he gripped the edge of his seat. "Doesn't matter," Jordan replied, staring straight ahead. "What matters is the message they're sending." Agent Harlan climbed in and shut the door behind him. He held the flyer in a clear evidence bag, his expression unreadable. "It's not just trash," he said. "There's a message." Jordan took the bag, squinting at the paper inside. Scrawled in red ink were jagged lines and symbols, a cipher of some sort. Below it, 6 printed words sent a chill through the van. Capitol View was just the first ascent. No one spoke. The words hung in the space like smoke, unseen but suffocating. Ezra's breathing grew heavier, the reality sinking in. This wasn't a fluke. It wasn't over. Agent Bryce's voice crackled over the radio. "Crowd dispersing. No injuries reported. We've detained 3 individuals for questioning." "None matching the throw?" Harlan asked into his earpiece. "Negative. Whoever threw it knew exactly what they were doing." Jordan leaned back against the cool wall of the van, closing his eyes for a second. The image of Ezra standing on that stage beside him, brave, vulnerable, visible, was burned into his memory. And now that visibility had become a beacon for something darker. "They were watching," he said quietly. "Planning." Agent Harlan nodded. "That line, first ascent, it implies escalation." Ezra turned toward his father, voice trembling. "What does that mean for us?" Jordan opened his eyes and met his son's gaze. "It means they wanted us to feel this exact thing. The fear, The chaos. To make us retreat. But we won't, right? Ezra asked, his voice steadier now, sharpened by defiance. We won't run. Jordan reached over and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. We won't. As the van pulled away from the plaza, sirens still echoed faintly in the distance. Helicopters circled above. On the surface, it would appear the press event had simply ended in panic. But for Jordan and Ezra, it marked something more. A shift from reactive defense to active resistance. The flyer wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of intent. Later that evening, back in the secured conference room of the hotel, Agent Mendez laid out the decoded version of the flyer on a steel table. The translation wasn't perfect, but the implication was clear. Symbols matching those found in previous Gray Trace communiques. Phrases that hinted at targeting nodes of influence. Phrases like public lineage and inherited spotlight. All euphemisms for children, for heirs. Jordan sat in silence, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the table. Ezra stood behind him, arms crossed tightly. They've changed tactics, Harlan said. They're not just targeting individuals anymore. They're going after what you represent, legacy. A long pause followed. Jordan stared at the decoded text, each line a reminder of what was at stake. His company, his voice, his son. They think they can silence us through symbolism, he murmured. But symbols cut both ways. Victor Miles, their legal advisor, leaned forward. What's your move now, Jordan? Jordan looked up. The room felt still, charged. We double down, he said. We go louder, clearer. We make sure every camera lens, every mic, every broadcast sees what they're afraid of, that we're not backing down. Not ever. No one objected. As the team reviewed the security footage and prepped a new security protocol for the coming days, Ezra approached the window and looked out at the city skyline. It was quiet. Too quiet. But in the hush, he found clarity. He turned and said, They're writing in symbols now. But so are we. We stood on that stage together, and that was our message. Jordan nodded, proud of his son's resolve. They hadn't chosen this fight, but now that it had chosen them, they would meet it with open eyes and unwavering purpose. Fear had a new language, and it spoke in symbols and silence. The steel doors groaned as they slid open, revealing the cavernous space of the freight hangar. Dust danced in the shafts of light piercing through the broken skylights. The Special Task Unit, clad in black tactical gear, swept in with silent precision. Weapons raised, eyes sharp. They moved like shadows across the concrete floor, boots crunching against gravel and rusted metal debris. Agent Harlan, at the lead, held up a closed fist, his signal to halt. A dim hum echoed from the far side of the hangar. That was where the command suspected the core of Gray Trace's safe house would be. As the agents approached the partitioned room made of plywood and industrial panels, the stench of stale coffee, sweat, and something metallic filled the air. One of the agents kicked the door open. Inside, the room told a chilling story. Along one wall were detailed flight blueprints pinned in sequence, routes, tail numbers, and commercial aircraft layouts marked in red ink. Next to them, a bulletin board displayed pilot schedules, terminal maps, and forged ID badges, each labeled with different airport security zones. The precision was disturbing. These weren't amateurs. They had studied vulnerabilities with the care of scientists. Jordan Braxton stood just behind the perimeter tape with Agent Mendez and Commander Lyle from the Federal Task Force. The overhead lights buzzed dimly, flickering with the electricity barely humming through the backup generator. Jordan's eyes scanned the room, lingering on the items that had once seemed like distant threats until now. "What is that?" Jordan asked quietly, pointing to the far wall. Agent Mendez didn't answer. He stepped forward and slowly peeled back the canvas tarp hanging across the back wall. A wave of silence fell over the room. Behind the tarp was a wall lined with photographs, at least 50 of them, pinned in neat rows with red strings connecting some. Jordan stepped forward, his footsteps slow, hesitant. These weren't just pictures. They were surveillance stills of children. Black boys mostly, sons, nephews, grandsons of high-profile executives, civil rights leaders, and elected officials. Then he saw it. Ezra. His son's photo, taken from what looked like an airport lounge, showed him seated beside Jordan, headphones on, gazing out the window. A red X had been drawn across his chest in thick marker. Jordan's breath hitched. The room swayed slightly beneath him, but he remained upright, fists clenched at his sides. His heart pounded like a war drum, his ears buzzing as if he'd just walked into the eye of a storm. Commander Lyle lowered his voice, stepping beside him. "They've been tracking your movements for months," Lyle said. "Yours, your son's, others. We believed this wasn't just about the flight. It was about legacy disruption, eliminating generational progress through fear." Jordan looked at the wall again, this time seeing it not as a map of targets, but as a battlefield. He imagined the fathers and uncles of the boys whose faces stared back at him, men like him who believed they were protecting the next generation by building in silence. But the silence had become a weapon, and now the enemy was speaking in surveillance and inked-out faces. Agent Harlan re-entered holding a metal case with a cracked keypad. "Encrypted drives," he said. "We'll know more soon, but what we've already found is enough to change the scope of the investigation." Jordan's jaw tightened. "They've been filming us, watching airports, studying our habits." He turned back to Lyle, voice calm but heavy with force. "We won't just respond anymore." Commander Lyle raised a brow. "We'll dismantle them from the inside," Jordan finished. Across the room, Ezra stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly, his posture stiff. He had refused to stay behind despite orders from the agents. He had to see it with his own eyes. When his father spoke those words, Ezra stepped forward. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with focus. "If they want to come after us," Ezra said, his voice low and even, "then they'd better know. We're not running." Jordan turned to look at him, pride and pain etched across his face. For a moment, father and son stood side by side, framed by the wall of red X's behind them and the agents slowly gathering the evidence of a war that had been waged in the shadows. Outside, the wind howled through the open hangar, kicking up dust across the runway. In the distance, a transport truck rumbled in, ready to carry out the seized evidence. The sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere beyond Orland County, the men behind the photographs were already planning their next move. But now, Jordan had seen their face, and they had seen his. Some threats don't end, they evolve into a purpose. Operation Deep Skies began not with applause, but with silence, the kind that fills a room after someone says the one thing no one wanted to hear. In a classified federal facility just outside Langston, a dozen screens lit up with intercepted data, usernames, IP logs, chat room transcripts. Each one pointed to a network spreading faster than anticipated. At the head of the room stood a man few knew was the operation's backbone, Jordan Braxton. He didn't wear a badge or military stripes. His only authority was the code running beneath every system in the room, written in his own hand. Jordan watched silently as an agent presented a schematic of a darknet forum used by Gray Trace to recruit and train its followers. The language was encoded, the interface masked, but he recognized the framework immediately. It was a forked version of an old open-source platform Arcline Systems had abandoned years ago, now twisted for radical use. The irony was sharp. What he'd once designed to democratize innovation had been weaponized against him and others like him. Section 4. B is handling ghost route tracking, said Agent Weller, a stern man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone. But we can't trace the uplink data without help from the private sector. Jordan didn't wait to be asked. "Give me 5 hours," he said, already reaching for the terminal. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, bypassing the usual barriers. "And I'll map their entire relay structure." In the corner, Victor Miles watched with a blend of pride and worry. "You're not here as a tech lead," he said softly, stepping closer. "You're a target. Don't forget that." Jordan didn't look up. "Exactly why I won't sit on the sidelines." Meanwhile, Ezra Braxton was writing his own chapter. Though just 17, he stood before a crowded auditorium at Silvergate Academy, speaking not as a victim, but as a voice. "We talk about firewalls and passwords," he told the group of high school students, his voice calm but steady. "But no one teaches you how to defend your dignity online or offline." He hadn't wanted to go at first. The trauma still sat heavy on his chest, especially at night. But something shifted after seeing the wall of photographs in the Orland County hangar, faces like his, young and wide-eyed, unknowingly marked by hate. He couldn't stay quiet anymore. Back at the Task Force Command Center, federal agents reviewed Clayton Renshaw's transfer papers. He was being moved to a high-security facility pending trial, now charged not only with attempted murder, but with conspiracy under federal anti-terror statutes. During a closed, pre-trial hearing, Jordan was called in for a testimony verification process. It was supposed to be routine, just a statement, a signature. But when he entered the hearing room, Clayton was already there, seated at the far end, hands shackled but spine rigid with defiance. He looked older, the hate in his eyes more brittle than before. For a moment there was silence. Then Clayton leaned forward, sneering as he spoke. "You think you're safe now?" Jordan didn't blink. He met the man's stare with the weight of everything that had happened, the flight, the fear, the truth exposed. "You made us visible," he said slowly, voice calm like thunder before a storm. "Now, everyone's watching." There was no applause, just the rustle of papers and the faint hum of an air vent. But it was enough. Clayton leaned back, eyes narrowing as if the walls had just closed in on him. Later that evening, Jordan returned to the Arcline campus. He bypassed the lobby, the cameras, the well-meaning stares of employees who didn't know whether to say "thank you" or "sorry." He entered the server wing alone, standing in the blue glow of a dozen cooling machines, all humming with data. Ezra stood behind him, arms crossed tightly. "They've changed tactics," Harlan said. "They're not just targeting individuals anymore. They're going after what you represent, legacy." A long pause followed. Jordan stared at the decoded text, each line a reminder of what was at stake. His company, his voice, his son. "They think they can silence us through symbolism," he murmured. "But symbols cut both ways." Victor Miles, their legal advisor, leaned forward. "What's your move now, Jordan?" Jordan looked up. The room felt still, charged. "We double down," he said. "We go louder, clearer. We make sure every camera lens, every mic, every broadcast sees what they're afraid of, that we're not backing down. Not ever." No one objected. As the team reviewed the security footage and prepped a new security protocol for the coming days, Ezra approached the window and looked out at the city skyline. It was quiet, too quiet. But in the hush, he found clarity. He turned and said, "They're writing in symbols now. But so are we. We stood on that stage together, and that was our message." Jordan nodded, proud of his son's resolve. They hadn't chosen this fight, but now that it had chosen them, they would meet it with open eyes and unwavering purpose. Fear had a new language, and it spoke in symbols and silence. The steel doors groaned as they slid open, revealing the cavernous space of the freight hangar. Dust danced in the shafts of light piercing through the broken skylights. The special task unit, clad in black tactical gear, swept in with silent precision. Weapons raised, eyes sharp. They moved like shadows across the concrete floor, boots crunching against gravel and rusted metal debris. Agent Harlan, at the lead, held up a closed fist, his signal to halt. A dim hum echoed from the far side of the hangar. That was where the command suspected the core of Gray Trace's safe house would be. As the agents approached the partitioned room made of plywood and industrial panels, the stench of stale coffee, sweat, and something metallic filled the air. One of the agents kicked the door open. Inside, the room told a chilling story. Along one wall were detailed flight blueprints pinned in sequence, routes, tail numbers, and commercial aircraft layouts marked in red ink. Next to them, a bulletin board displayed pilot schedules, terminal maps, and forged ID badges, each labeled with different airport security zones. The precision was disturbing. These weren't amateurs. They had studied vulnerabilities with the care of scientists. Jordan Braxton stood just behind the perimeter tape with Agent Mendez and Commander Lyle from the Federal Task Force. The overhead lights buzzed dimly, flickering with the electricity barely humming through the backup generator. Jordan's eyes scanned the room, lingering on the items that had once seemed like distant threats until now. "What is that?" Jordan asked quietly, pointing to the far wall. Agent Mendez didn't answer. He stepped forward and slowly peeled back the canvas tarp hanging across the back wall. A wave of silence fell over the room. Behind the tarp was a wall lined with photographs, at least 50 of them, pinned in neat rows with red strings connecting some. Jordan stepped forward, his footsteps slow, hesitant. These weren't just pictures. They were surveillance stills of children. Black boys mostly, sons, nephews, grandsons of high-profile executives, civil rights leaders, and elected officials. Then he saw it. Ezra. His son's photo, taken from what looked like an airport lounge, showed him seated beside Jordan, headphones on, gazing out the window. A red X had been drawn across his chest in thick marker. Jordan's breath hitched. The room swayed slightly beneath him, but he remained upright, fists clenched at his sides. His heart pounded like a war drum, his ears buzzing as if he'd just walked into the eye of a storm. Commander Lyle lowered his voice, stepping beside him. "They've been tracking your movements for months," Lyle said. "Yours, your son's, others. We believed this wasn't just about the flight. It was about legacy disruption, eliminating generational progress through fear." Jordan looked at the wall again, this time seeing it not as a map of targets, but as a battlefield. He imagined the fathers and uncles of the boys whose faces stared back at him, men like him who believed they were protecting the next generation by building in silence. But the silence had become a weapon, and now the enemy was speaking in surveillance and inked-out faces. Agent Harlan re-entered holding a metal case with a cracked keypad. "Encrypted drives," he said. "We'll know more soon. But what we've already found is enough to change the scope of the investigation." Jordan's jaw tightened. "They've been filming us, watching airports, studying our habits." He turned back to Lyle, voice calm but heavy with force. "We won't just respond anymore." Commander Lyle raised a brow. "Like what?" Ezra hesitated, then leaned closer. "Tell them what it felt like to fly again, with fear still buckled beside you. That's what people don't see." Jordan studied his son's face. There were no cracks in the armor anymore, just truth. Honest, hard-earned truth. The intercom crackled softly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. Smooth skies ahead." Jordan returned the notebook to his lap, then turned slightly toward Ezra. "You're not just a survivor anymore," he said. Ezra gave a knowing smile, his voice firm and clear. "And you're not just a CEO anymore." Behind them, Agent Cole shifted slightly, his gaze calm but ever watchful. A silent sentinel in the sky? The moment held. The past hadn't disappeared, it never would, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't hold them hostage. Jordan leaned back, eyes forward. In a sky once filled with threat, now flew two men who refused to fall. He thought he could intimidate, but justice was closer than he knew. If you stand for strength, protection, and accountability, hit subscribe and join the channel. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights the dangers of racial hatred, the threat of in-flight violence, and the importance of swift justice in the face of bigotry. Its purpose is to provoke thought about the realities of racial profiling, the importance of security, and the power of unseen protection in moments of crisis.